Hi there! I had a lot of fun watching Ridley Scott's Prometheus. It's been over a week since I first saw it in the theater, and for some reason it still resonates with me, so I thought it'd be fun to explore the subtext and symbolism that occurs throughout the movie. Prometheus starts out with shots of waterfalls and a cloaked figure below a flying saucer that drinks something which causes its body to disintegrate and fall into the water as its DNA breaks apart and then cells mutate in the water. The introduction to a motion picture is usually designed to set the style and tone for the storytelling. When you see a James Bond film, it often starts with an action set piece. Therefore, you know it's a thriller. But with more art house style films, they will often start with symbolic imagery. Take The Graduate, for example. I believe Prometheus' opening scene is designed to set you up on a symbolic journey. So if you watch it expecting a horror thriller, you may be disappointed and confused. But if you have an open mind and try to read into the symbolism and subtext, you may find the film to be a more rewarding experience. The main problem with symbolist art is that the viewer needs to understand certain cultural concepts that inspired the work. In the case of The Persistence of Memory, if you look at it and wonder why the clocks are not realistic, you're really missing out on what the storyteller Salvador Dali was trying to express: a visual interpretation of Einstein's theory that time is relative and not linear. In regards to Prometheus, you have to know a bit about the Christian religion and the ancient astronaut theory to be able to decipher the symbolism and subtext that appears throughout the movie. I thought it was interesting at how quickly they traveled to another solar system. I'm not sure how far they traveled in the movie, but the nearest galaxy is 25,000 light years away, and they got to LV-223 in 2 years. So, they were traveling really freaking fast. Anyway, they end up on LV-223 on Christmas Day, the day our Lord was born. LV-223 may refer to the Bible passage Leviticus 22:3, something about unclean people being banished when they meet the Lord. One striking design element is the Rubik's Cube.
These are ancient civilizations from all over the earth, and yet this same pictogram was discovered at every one of them.
This technologically advanced Rubik's Cube is Ridley Scott reminding you that you're about to be treated with a riddle.
Again, down, bottom up, pops a corner up. Now do that 4 times, who needs beginner's luck?
This movie is going to be more like a game where you'll have to try and figure out how the pieces work together.
Please tell me you can read that.
There's a fun bit of dialogue between Robot David and Holloway.
Provided your thesis is correct.
Provided it's correct.
That's why they call it a thesis.
They emphasize the word thesis. Following that auditory cue, there will be a set of visual evidence supporting Shaw and Holloway's belief that the engineers engineered us, or rather, the ancient astronaut theory.
The mysteries of the past manifest themselves on all continents. There are scores of rock paintings which date back far in time. This sketch represents Wandjina, the legendary goddess of the Milky Way. She too came from heaven to instruct the children of Earth, one model for these deities found on all continents: in Australia, in America, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia.
The spacecraft enters the harsh exhaust pipe atmosphere, and Holloway points out
God does not build in straight lines.
this refers to the Nazca lines in Peru.
Lines which would mean nothing from the ground. Cut there at least 2,000 years ago. From an aircraft, they fall into focus: a spider and a hummingbird.
Could the complex set of lines covering Peru's Nazca Plain be evidence of runways for a worldwide air transportation system?
So those lines lead them into the pyramid. Deep inside, they discover that somehow terraforming is occurring. Here is a real trippy theory that Ridley Scott may be proposing. There was a time in Earth's history where the atmosphere was toxic and exhaust-like. Scientists have a hypothesis that over 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs were wiped out when an asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula, causing mega tsunamis, acid rain, global wildfires, and hellish dust that blanketed the Earth for almost a decade. Today, there are ancient ruins of the Mayan civilization around the crater that killed our dinosaurs. So, could Ridley Scott be suggesting that some pyramids on Earth may have functioned as terraforming stations around the world?
The core of the pyramids, at least at Giza, are made out of one type of limestone. And because of that metal content, that kind of limestone conducts electricity pretty well. And then they chose to sheath the pyramid in the whiter Tura limestone. But it also has almost zero magnesium content. and therefore it's a much poorer conductor of electricity. It's closer to a pure calcium carbonate. Basically what we've got here is we've got a situation with a highly electrically conductive core of those pyramids wrapped in what is effectively a very effective insulator. Why the granite in the passageways, and so of course I'm thinking from an electrical point of view. Granite is slightly radioactive, and it will ionize or electrify the air.
The iconic monolith head evokes the Easter Island figures on Earth, so you get the sense that these engineers may also be artistic and religious. Surrounding the head are mysterious vases, which I think are Baghdad batteries, a favorite piece of evidence that ancient astronaut theorists use to show that technology was taught to ancient man.
In a museum in Baghdad, we find these small clay cups dating to the time of Christ. A small copper tube was introduced into the narrow neck. A rod, made of an alloy of different metals, was inserted in the tube. When filled with hydrochloric acid, the device produces an electric current. Count Volta invented the electric cell 1,500 years later.
Oh, the head. It's changing.
And there's the morphing dome, which is symbolic of a gateway to a higher realm. These symbolic images draw a connection between the engineers and ancient man.
During the Second World War, American soldiers were sent to certain isolated islands in the South Pacific. And a very curious thing happened. The natives of these islands isolated from the outside world. Very soon afterwards, the natives began making straw and bamboo fetishes resembling airplanes.
Moments later, there is a startling image that is shown a few times. On the wall, there's a relief of a crucifix which looks like an alien mounted on it. When I first saw this, I thought maybe this was an alternate history, an alternate reality. But ultimately, I think the film is symbolically showing that Jesus was an engineer.
Whether it be at the birth of Jesus or his resurrection, we've got the possibility of other powers from another world being involved from the beginning to the end.
The more literal version is the idea that Jesus is strictly alien. Even if you take him as the Son of God, then obviously he is not of this earth.
This part also reminds me of the Leviticus 22:3 passage. Basically, everyone in the room is going to die, except for Shaw, who has an unbreakable faith in God. My favorite moment happens when they are back in the ship with the engineer head and discover that the head's exoskeleton is really a helmet. Everyone in the theater was shocked when they saw that. This is an amazing dramatization of another ancient astronaut theory.
This is a dogu figure, and it comes from Japan. And even to the untrained eye, you look at this, and it's as if this being is wearing some type of a suit with a helmet, some goggles. On the back, there are all these weird buckles and circles, straps. Very similar to a modern-day spacesuit. In my opinion, this is a likeness of a possible extraterrestrial that visited Earth thousands of years ago.
So, before the head explodes, they make a point to show that it's bleeding the black goo. In the following scene, Robot David is examining the Baghdad battery and finds a black goo inside one of the shafts and says the line,
"Big things have small beginnings."
Well, I'm going to take a guess and say the engineers were filling these vases with their own blood, which ties into one of the larger themes of self-sacrifice. This biobattery is actually a real thing in today's world. I think it's a possibility that the engineers may have powered their ship with it. Back in the tunnels, there's a snake, which in Christianity is a symbol of Satan, a guardian of forbidden knowledge. This suggests that the engineers discovered something we shouldn't know. One weird part in Prometheus was the engineer playing a flute. Music ties into mathematics. If you remember in high school geometry, there was an equation you had to memorize called the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Many people don't realize this, but the Greek mathematician Pythagoras, whom this equation was named after, was actually a religious figure that created a religion based on numbers. He thought that if you could understand numbers, you can understand the mind of God. It was said that Pythagoras could heal the sick by playing the flute. This ability was based on his theory called the music of the spheres. which I believe you see in this scene. Basically, the sun and planets can be expressed in mathematical ratios, and those spheres produce a specific hum. I know this sounds crazy, but consider the nutty things that come out of theoretical physics, like the string theory, which basically says that our world isn't created by atoms and molecules, but by harmonious strings vibrating in 10 or 11 dimensions.
String theory is based on the simple observation that all the matter we see around us could be musical notes on a vibrating string. If I take an electron and had a super microscope, it can zero it right in, I would see a rubber band. And if I twang it a different way, the rubber band goes from electron to neutrino. I twang it again, it turns into a quark. And if I twang it enough times, it turns into all the thousands of subatomic particles that we physicists have been cataloging.
I honestly barely understand what that means, but it ties into the idea that these engineers have mastered the ability to manipulate space and time. Oh, and there's a globe hovering over the living engineer that shows Africa. Is it just me, or shouldn't these engineers be black? If these gods made us in their image, they should be African. Next, there's a whole bunch of Christian symbolism. So, Holloway has some problems and they go back to the ship. Vickers whips out a flamethrower and Holloway decides to sacrifice himself. This is another Christian symbol. Holloway with his arms spread apart in a crucifix pose suggests that he may have renewed his belief in God. Then there's a whole mysterious birth scene, which is another Christian parallel of the Virgin Mary conceiving Jesus.
Is such a thing even possible? Yes, it is. Today, artificial insemination. That's what happens today. You no longer have to have sex in order to have babies. We have the exact same description thousands of years ago, where women, without sleeping with anyone, all of a sudden became pregnant.
Did aliens that came to Earth in ancient times use advanced fertility technology?
And then we discovered old Wayland was alive and he looks like a zombie, which I think was intentional. He symbolizes someone that is supposed to be dead, but didn't go into the afterlife. So when we first discover Wayland, the whole time Robot David is washing his feet, which is another Christian symbol of cleansing false ideas. Because Wayland is killed later, this suggests that he has corrupt beliefs and doesn't understand eternal life or willing to accept the afterlife.
We are the gods now.
There's a bit of dialogue later that Vickers says,
"A king has his reign, and then he dies."
Which sounds like she's referring to Egyptian religious beliefs. The Wayland logo is inspired by the winged sun symbol of ancient Egyptians. At this point, I've been twisting this symbolism and trying to decipher the subtext from key pieces of dialogue, and I'm getting the sense that this movie really is about time and space. I'll explain more on that later. Robot David starts to get really creepy when he asks, "Doesn't everyone want their parents dead?" It's as if he's symbolically transformed into Satan. He's going to rebel against his creator. There's some sort of forbidden knowledge that he acquired from his observations and experiments. So Wayland and everyone go back to wake up the last engineer. And remember the 22:3 Bible passage? Well, basically everyone gets killed except for Shaw. The engineer just stares at her as she runs away. Shaw is the only true believer in an afterlife. In other words, heaven. The engineer goes on with his business and jumps in his cockpit, which resembles the controversial sarcophagus lid of an ancient Mayan king. It's another piece of evidence that the ancient astronaut theorists use as proof that we were visited in the past.
This stone deity, say the Maya, represents Kukulkan, who came from the stars and returned there.
Finally, as we reach the conclusion, we catch a moment of the pilot saying something about a bet and paying it back on the other side. The subtext is obvious here. They have a renewed belief in God. And of course, the captain throws his arms out like Holloway did earlier in a crucifix pose before he crashes into the engineer's ship. At the end, there's a fun exchange between David and Shaw, who doesn't want to return to Earth, but go to where the engineers came from. At this point, it's really hard to trust anything that Satan Robot David is saying. I think he knows something sinister that he's not revealing, which I'll get into in a bit. The idea in this scene was like a spin-off on what Carl Sagan said in his documentary Cosmos.
In many cultures, the customary answer is that a god or gods created the universe out of nothing. But if we wish to pursue this question courageously, we must, of course, ask the next question. Where did God come from?
If there is a God, who created that God? It makes you wonder. Anyway, what the heck did all these symbols and suggestions amount to? Aliens playing flutes, human sacrifices, the alien crucifix, eternal life. What I personally got out of this movie relates to Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory. I like to think this science fiction fantasy is a cautionary tale about time travel. Towards the end of the movie, the captain all of a sudden explains that under the pyramid is a cargo hold and it's some kind of weapons lab. Everyone agrees that the exposition was very convenient, and as a screenwriter, I think that was actually what storytellers call a red herring. This is a clue that is proposed to really mislead you from the actual issue. You see this plot point all the time in crime shows like CSI. So if it's not really a cargo hold, what is it? Throughout the film, they're running around a circular tunnel system. This looks like something we have on Earth today, the Large Hadron Collider. Remember when that thing was about to get booted up, there were critics who believed we were going to create a black hole and destroy the world? One of the purposes of that machine is to smash particles together to create a mini Big Bang in hopes of discovering the elusive Higgs boson, or what some call the God particle. So remember how in the beginning of the movie, the Prometheus ship traveled really freaking fast? Let's assume that the Large Hadron Collider gave us information that allowed us to develop spacecraft that could travel close to the speed of light. Then we could travel to distant galaxies. The problem with traveling near the speed of light is that time slows down for people in the spacecraft, but thousands of years would pass on Earth, which would not be very fun to come back to. So instead of traveling really fast, it makes more sense to bend time and space and warp through a wormhole.
The term wormhole came from an analogy with an apple. You want to get from one part of the apple to another part. If you're a worm, you can eat your way down into the body of the apple and make a little tunnel and come out the other way, and it's shorter.
Inventing that technology may be too risky to experiment with on Earth, or even in our own galaxy. So maybe we go off to another galaxy and land on LV-223 and set up an even more insane atom smasher. And here we discover how to manipulate time and space. So we go back to Earth, but now we can go back to Earth at any specific time in history. Maybe we go back to ancient Egypt and change the past to alter the future, or even mutate our own DNA to affect human evolution. If you've ever seen the movie Back to the Future, you know that if you tamper with one event, it could go out of control and maybe cause certain people to not even be born.
The murals are changing. I think we've affected the atmosphere in the room.
You'd really be screwing up the sacred pattern of life and afterlife. I like to think that engineers are really us. We kept going forwards and backwards in time, accidentally evolved into these super beings that lost our ability to procreate. Notice there aren't any engineer chicks. So, in order to set things right again, our future selves as engineers decided to commit self-sacrifice on LV-223 and forever keep the technology of bending time and space a secret. And of course, the one person who was the catalyst for this sacrificial idea is David.
Oops, sorry.
In the future, just as we evolved into being engineers, David evolves into the monolith head, the keeper of the forbidden knowledge. Yup, that's my elaborate theory, and I'm sure it's wrong. There are plenty of plot holes in my argument. Personally, I think the ancient astronaut theory is compelling, but some of their evidence is a bit of a stretch. I'm also not religious, but I do believe there is a divine order to the universe. Scientific laws couldn't exist if the world wasn't designed. Well, I hope you realize that not all movies have to be taken so literally. Just like fine art, music, dance, literature, some movies are designed for a more cerebral experience. In the case of Prometheus, I think you can get a lot more out of it by coming up with your own theory and seeing it a second time to look out for evidence that may support your own personal beliefs. I hope you got a kick out of my video. If you thought it was interesting, you may like a film I wrote and directed called Minty the Assassin. It's not as serious as Prometheus, it's more of a B-movie inspired by one of my favorite B-movie actresses, Misty Monday. She made movies like Spider Babe and Lord of the G-Strings. My film is about chicks, martial arts,
I learned that from Pat Morita, bitch.
And science.
Do you know what a black hole is, Minty? The space between your legs.
It's available on DVD and streaming on Amazon.com. Peace.